series. Today's webinar topic is there a little echo? Andrea, yourself for 1 second. There you go. Today's webinar topic is 7 risks you should take to build trust. Our host is Andrea Howe. She's the co-author of the Trusted Advisor Fieldbook and founder of the Get Real project. The webinar series is in partnership with Trusted Advisor Associates. We have Andrea's contact information. We'll share it at the end if you have any questions. Throughout the webinar, there's a chat feature on the bottom. You can just ask any questions openly. We're going to try to answer every question. We'll answer a few throughout the webinar, and at the very end, around 11:30ish, we'll save time for any other questions. Can probably should we move on to the next slide?
Yeah, please do.
I think you're controlling some. I'm not controlling the slides.
Oh, yes, please move on to the next slide. Oh yeah, that's me. We're off to a good start. See, if I had only had my disco walk-on music, I'd be smooth as silk right now.
Well, yeah, we'll get that queued up. Next time we got some disco music to get it started. So everybody, as I said, welcome back. This is a regular series. We do it quarterly. We started almost 2 years ago now. Our next webinar is on November 12th. It's how to sell to an irrational buyer. You can register on trustedadvisor.com/webinars. We have a whole bunch of recorded webinars. I think we're up to 10 at this point, and we're going to be announcing our next schedule in the fall. And we're actually going to send out a poll to everybody with probably some topic ideas to get a gauge of what you guys are interested in learning more about. Hop on to the next one. So everyone's on mute, but there is a chat feature, as I mentioned, on the bottom. So you can just ask any questions publicly, or my name is Jason Gluskin. I help out Trusted Advisor in the Get Real project with marketing. You can just ask me, and we'll save the questions for the end. Technically, we're going to answer all questions at the end, but we're going to might pause for here and there for a few questions, and everything is being recorded. I'm going to pass it off to Andrea. Thank you for the time, and welcome everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. And greetings to everybody from a lovely hotel room in San Diego, where you have I'll turn this way, the pleasure of experiencing the lovely generic hotel room artwork and the occasional airplane landing outside. So I thank you in advance for your patience and good humor with whatever distractions, hopefully mild, there might be. But the life of a consultant, right, on the road. And that is, by the way, for those of you who don't know me, it's how I started on this journey nearly 30 years ago as an IT consultant, where at the time I learned what I'm going to characterize as bad lessons about risk-taking and the relationship between taking risk and relationships. The implicit and sometimes explicit lessons that I learned were basically risk as little as possible in terms of personal risk. Oh, of course, you want to build rapport with clients and be friendly. And yes, we want to have great relationships, but we also, for example, we don't ever want to let them see us sweat. So happily, when I created the partnership that I have with Charlie Green and Trusted Advisor Associates more than 13 years ago now, hard to believe, I really got to crystallize some critical lessons about the relationship between trust building and risk taking. And I see it now. I'm very excited to come to you today with this topic because to me it's such an exciting one. It's a breath of fresh air. And there are so many brilliant opportunities to take our relationships to the next level by applying some very, in some cases, simple lessons. The first, by the way, the first and most important lesson about trust building in general, mindset is everything. If you get your thinking squared away, then your feelings and actions will naturally follow. And that includes and starts with how you think about trust. And when Charlie and I wrote the Trusted Advisor Fieldbook, which was published 7 years ago now, a little more than that, we created something called a mnemonic device called the 3 Ps of trust to help us all get our thinking right about trust building. We said first and foremost, it's personal. It's a phenomenon that occurs between human beings, not humans and institutions or groups. Secondly, it's paradoxical. Said more simply, it appears to defy logic. And lastly, and most relevant to our topic for today, the mouthful of the 3 Ps, it's positively correlated to risk. In other words, the more risk you take, and by risk I mean personal risk, the more trust you tend to build. We consider these to be fundamental truths, which we outlined in chapter 1 of the Fieldbook. And the great news is, when we, as consultants, people in various services roles, anybody who's interested in having a better relationship with customers or clients, when we master risk-taking, then we have an opportunity to employ what is paradoxically the greatest risk mitigation strategy of all. So let's see. Bottom line, risk and trusted advisorship go hand in hand. You can be a trusted expert without taking a lot of personal risk. You can be a trusted problem solver. What you cannot be is a safe haven for tough issues, and that is the very essence of what it means to be a trusted advisor. So that's the context for this conversation today. We're setting a pretty high bar for the kinds of relationships that we want to have, and it's so important, by the way, this risk-taking topic, that Charlie and I specifically called it out as one of the 5 trust skills in the book. But it's also, you'll notice, it's inherent. Not only is it a separate skill, it's its own, but it's inherent in the other 4. You don't listen masterfully without taking some risk. Improvisation is inherently risky. Partnerships are risky. Even knowing yourself well requires some personal risk. So it's ubiquitous, if you will, if your goal is safe haven for tough issues. And there are a few important things to fundamentally understand about the relationship between trust building and risk taking. First of all, if your goal is trusted advisor, your life is not likely to be spent feeling comfortable all the time. It's certainly not all the time. Your aim then becomes to get comfortable being uncomfortable. So that's the reality of it. Truism number 1. Secondly, connecting to the trust equation, that safe haven part of safe haven for tough issues has a direct connection to the intimacy variable in the trust equation, which the data collected by Trusted Advisor Associates shows is the most important variable to pay attention to of the 4. Another trust truism, risk is to trust essentially as inoculation is to immunity. So small doses taken early mitigate larger risks or issues in the future. Interestingly, when we look inside ourselves, the reasons, the rationalizations, the justifications we come up with for not taking risks in a variety of situations, they're usually, they connect back to personal fears. They're really all about our personal fears. They just masquerade as business justifications. And oh, by the way, trust building is not a linear function. Let's see from my video, which way should I be doing that to angle it to you? I have no idea, but you get the point. It's not a line that goes up and to the right, wherever right is for you. Trust building is much more like a step function, and we have an opportunity to take our relationships higher and higher. And in particular, in moments of truth, moments of opportunity, where we can lean in and take risks and actually create something transformational in our relationships. So I want to share a little bit, tee up the first of our 7 lessons, because we're going to cover 7 concrete things today that will give you specific tools you can take to become a better risk taker, but with a story that was told by a participant in one of my workshops some years ago. And it was a story of how a sales meeting went down, and basically collection of salespeople or consultants, collection of clients, and at a key point, what happened? They heard nothing but crickets. And Jared, we'll call the participant who was recounting the story and who was leading the meeting, was so uncomfortable with the silence. And in the debrief, never got discussed or addressed, but in the debrief, Jared and his teammates, they all agreed it was uncomfortable. Everybody noticed it, but nobody agreed what was behind the silence. They had no idea what client silent because they were turned off, were they wowed and therefore speechless, and they never explicitly found out. They never actually asked in the moment. And this brings us to sort of an interesting point in terms of, in these moments of truth, what are the options that are available to us? And if you're a quick chat person, you can enter something in the chat box. I want you to choose for me, what do you think Jared and his team should have done? Now, there is a case to be made for option A, which is nothing different, kind of like it's not really a big deal. We don't want to overanalyze every single moment. We don't want to get hyper vigilant and super self-conscious, and there's a lot of truth to that. there's a case to be made for, maybe the best thing to do is follow up privately. Maybe you'll get more information that way, better quality response. There's also a case to be made for actually saying something in the moment. And I see in the chat box, I see at least one B, maybe there was an A that snuck in. I see a lot of C's.
A lot of C's.
Yeah, a lot of C's. There's
one B. Couple B's.
Couple B's. Look, so here's a fundamental lesson. It's all situational here. There is rarely ever an exact black and white right answer for what you should do. There's definitely answers that tend toward greater risk-taking and more trust building, and that's obviously option C. And in this case, what Jared recounted to me is that he and his team really wanted to establish themselves as trusted advisors. And toward that end, I'd say the right option was C, if they had a do-over, because they missed a moment, they missed an opportunity. Even if the client wasn't comfortable to respond, by offering the invitation, they're communicating something important. Now, by the way, for those of you who answered C, I would suggest, as we're doing this little sort of armchair quarterbacking, as we call it in the United States, consider that it's far easier to sit back on a webinar and evaluate somebody else's moment of truth story and know what they should have done. It's another thing entirely for ourselves to be, you know, in that deer in headlights moment. So this little story leads us to tip 1 of 7, which is to tackle ambiguity as best you can whenever it arises. And I'll give you some hints about when ambiguity shows up, because sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's subtle. If you find yourself thinking, or maybe even saying, you know, but I'm not sure, or, well, I'm assuming, or, well, I think it's because, or, well, it seems like, those are signs that ambiguity is present, and perhaps there's an opportunity to lean in. I got Charlie's permission to share a story actually from just last week, because I think it's such a brilliant example of tackling ambiguity in practice. Charlie realized that he was unclear with a relatively new client, high visibility engagement. It was actually unclear about who was who. In general, in this very large organization, in general with the group with whom he's working, fairly senior level group, but even more specifically at who was who at a key meeting that he had attended a few weeks prior. And, you know, what would most of us do in that case? Most of us would say, shoot, I should know this. Let me find this out. And we would dig and we would research and we would ask around the edges. But what Charlie did is something quite different, and I would suggest to you quite bold. He sent an email to the key client contact. The subject line of the email was a dumb question, if I may. And he just, you know, he laid it out point blank, looking over my notes. I realize I don't know the answer to a really dumb question. I am deciding here, choosing to bear my ignorance with you. Can you help me with the difference between these and this count and this one? And the dumb question is, and he laid it out in black and white, who was at our recent gathering? Sorry for asking the basics. I figure better to look dumb now than stupid later. And I love this example for so many reasons. By the way, what he got back was an immediate, very gracious, and long reply, telling him everything he needed to know about the who's who and more, in a way that was probably more compelling than what he'd been briefed on in the past. I love this example, and I just challenge you as you're listening to it to think about, wow, you know, how often would you go that route? Would you have the courage to do it? And for many of us, the short answer to that is not often enough, because we typically don't take these kinds of risks more often for a simple reason. And the simple reason is we're afraid. We're afraid of the awkwardness, the embarrassment, maybe the backlash. Charlie might have gotten dismissed from the account for not being a savvier consultant than he was. That in fact, quite the opposite happened. The relationship deepened as a result. Jared, in the Jared example with the sales meeting, Jared allowed his fear to suppress his natural curiosity. Charlie chose not to allow anything to suppress his natural curiosity. Now, if you thought Jared's situation was awkward, let's talk about another one. And this is actually a client of Charlie's. It's a story told by Charlie, so I'm going to continue to borrow some Charlie-isms. We're going to call this client Adam. Adam had a workday ritual when he was in his office around 2 o'clock every day. He would call his spouse, have a brief conversation, and at the end of that brief conversation, he would hang up with by saying, I love you. And one day, Adam happened to be not on the phone with his spouse at 2 o'clock. He happened to be on the phone with his client at 2 o'clock. And you guessed it. What did he do at the end of the call? He found himself saying, I love you, bye, to the client. Now, it's easy to laugh at the story. Imagine that you're Adam in this case. You know, what do most of us do in this case? And maybe something that extreme hasn't happened to you, but I bet you've had some uncomfortable moments, because there's no shortage of them when we're in relationship, in business. They're the occasional accidental I love yous, they're the awkward silences like Jared experienced, they're just moments of embarrassment, so many more. And what happens for most of us is we go into survival mode, and we think, you know, Adam thinks to himself, I love that we have a dog in the background. It's not my dog, just, you know, I don't have a dog in the hotel room. Adam, not knowing how to deal with the I love you situation. Oh God, maybe he didn't hear it, and we just, you know, bury it and pretend it didn't happen. Jared in the sales meeting, you know, our survival mode has us go, well, maybe they were quiet because they were wowed. That must be it. We find ways to rationalize and explain and basically avoid dealing with the discomfort. And that leads us to tip number 2 of 7, which bottom line is to acknowledge those uncomfortable situations out loud. It's a close cousin of tip number 1. It's just a little more broad, and there's some real upside of doing this. When our goal is to be a safe haven for tough issues, there's some real downsides of not doing it. Like, consider Adam, he didn't do anything to acknowledge what had happened. Charlie happened to see him a few months after the I love you incident. He said, hey, how's it going with that client? Adam said, I don't know, I haven't talked to him since. So that's a real downside, like losing a relationship over something like that. Now, what Adam and Jared needed was something that Charlie had, and that's what we call a caveat. A caveat is basically a short, emotionally honest statement that helps us, you know, acknowledge an awkward moment. So, you know, Adam could have said, oh boy, this is awkward, and I hope I'm not making things worse with this callback. Or Jared could have said in the moment, you know, the caveats are in white, by the way, if you're looking at the screen. I'm not sure how to interpret the silence in the room. Charlie, with his email, I decided to bear my ignorance and simply ask, what are the differences between? And we find caveats by looking inward. We look at our own worries, fears, concerns, the things that have us not want to acknowledge the thing that there is to be acknowledged, and then those become our caveats. Caveats, by the way, are also really helpful when we need to deliver bad news, and that happens sometimes on occasion, sometimes on a regular basis, depending upon the nature of the work that you're doing. For example, you've got to tell a client or a customer we're not going, or a colleague, we're not going to make the deadline. You need to raise the fact that executive sponsorship that's needed is missing, a team member is departing, or in the case of, look, you got to call a client out on their team as being part of the problem. It's not just you, sometimes it's them too. So the caveats in white, they help us here too. Which one is the right caveat to use? It completely depends on the situation, depends on your style, depends on the relationship, depends on the sender, the receiver. You wouldn't want, by the way, a doctor delivering you a difficult diagnosis to say, well, I may be missing the mark. Might be more appropriate to say there's no easy way to say this. And this, by the way, leads us to tip number 3 of 7, delivering bad news promptly and concisely, with an emphasis, by the way, on the prompt and concise part. Most of us don't need to be told that we should be adept at delivering bad news, but where we get hung up as human beings, because we have a tendency to be fear-based, is on the prompt, concise bit. Now you'll notice, even with a caveat, those example statements that I just shared, they're pretty concise, so that's good. It's not the end of the conversation, it's getting the thing out there to talk about in a short, concise, and sensitive and trust-building way. The prompt part can be impacted in ways we don't realize. We can be sneakily avoidant or sneakily delaying. We have a tendency to delay or avoid, by the way, in general, because we're very analytical and our analysis is often faulty when we look at the pros and cons of dealing with bad news. And we as humans, we have a tendency, we both underestimate and overestimate. We'll underestimate the value of forthrightness. We forget that our willingness to just deal with stuff is more often than not seen as a virtue and usually outweighs the difficulty of the situation in the moment. And we overestimate in two ways. We tend to overestimate the cost of disapproval. The recipients of our messages aren't nearly as plagued by the fears of relationship damage and long-term ramifications and all of that as we are. The recipients of our messages are also much more inclined than we realize to themselves deal with stuff. Let's just deal with it and move on. We have a tendency to overestimate the chance that a situation is going to resolve itself, like the I love you situation or the silence in the sales meeting. And so being prompt really makes sense if you unskew your analysis and really recognize the relationship between trust building and risk taking. Now, at this point, some of you may be saying, tell me something new already. We've got 3 things on the list and none of it's rocket science. And you know what? It's absolutely right. None of it's rocket science. And that's actually part of the beauty in what's available to all of us in terms of taking our relationships to a whole new level. It isn't rocket science. It's ridiculously simple. It's also not easy. And so many of you, I'm going to make a bold statement at the risk of pissing you off or being confrontational at this point in the webinar, not quite halfway through. You're missing opportunities, possibly every day, for sure every week, to build trust and to take these kinds of risks simply because you don't see them, you're rationalizing away, you're not recognizing the benefit, you're overly weighing the downside, all of the things that naturally happens. So teeing up tip number 4, none of us likes to call attention to the mistakes that we've made. It's also completely human to make them. What matters is how we handle them, and it's refreshing to be real and candid about them. It's why it's one of the 17 lines in the Get Real Manifesto that I created. Mistakes are inevitable. How you handle them reveals your true character. And tip number 4 is to actually take responsibility for them. When the bad news you have to deliver is due to a mistake on your part, own it fully, own it proactively. And by the way, if it's not a mistake on your part, but it's a mistake on your team's part, or let's say a colleague's part, and you told them, don't do it this way, and they did it this way anyway, or your team screwed something up, or your organization has screwed something up, my advice to you is the same. It's to own it. Be willing to say to the client, look, I'm a representative of this team and this organization. I am owning that this happened. I'm owning the solution, but I'm owning first and foremost that it happened. And again, paradoxically, our willingness to say I or we screwed up, when we look at it in the light through the lens of the trust equation, we see the trust trifecta that it creates, because we build credibility with our honesty, we increase intimacy in our vulnerability, and we're lowering self-orientation, in other words, increasing our other focus. Because what we're showing when we're willing to own stuff and own it early and often is that we care so much more about the relationship than we care about, let's say, the CYA, cover your you-know-what strategy that can be common in many organizations. Yeah, Charlie, I just want to call out what you just put in chat because I think it's a great point. You're saying it doesn't mean apologizing for things that are not your fault. I completely agree. It's acknowledging our role in the matter, absolutely. Now, some of you also at this point might be thinking, well, all of this is great ways for us to take the high road, but wouldn't it be nice if they, our colleagues, our customers, our clients, the people with whom we're trying to build trust, would take on these best practices too? And my short answer to you is, yeah, it would be nice. It would be nice. But there's unfortunately no guarantee of that. And it is frustrating when others aren't modeling the same principles and behaviors that we're bringing to the table. And let's face it, you know, relationships can be challenging. All relationships in our life are challenging, and we'll have reactions and emotions, and we have a tendency in the face of those reactions, tamp them down. You know, all right, let me just set that to the side. Let me take a deep breath here. Or maybe we don't set it to the side, but we divert it to a conversation with a colleague. Let's say we do some venting. We complain to everybody but the source of our frustration or our reaction. And we do that all in the name of, you know, what we call professionalism, because we're pros and that's the appropriate thing to do. And while I'm not suggesting I'm giving you carte blanche to leak your emotions and your high reactivity all over everybody, that's high self-orientation. You gotta manage yourself and manage it well. I am suggesting that trust-based relationships are partnerships, and they include us, and our emotions are legit and valid. So that leads us to tip number 5, is to actually be willing to express your own emotions. For example, when you're frustrated, when you're nervous. Oh, heck yeah, I'm nervous. The stakes are high here. When you're disappointed, let's say because you've lost, you tell a client, we completely respect your decision and we're really, really disappointed. Or how about the flip side, when you're excited, when you've won something big, when something's a big opportunity for you and you're really excited to engage. Because if you never share your frustration, your nervousness, your disappointment, your excitement, how will they ever know how much you care? And if you never share yourself and who you are and your humanity, how will it ever be safe for them to do the same? And if it's not safe for them to do the same, then you are not fundamentally a safe haven. All right, so I'm going to tee up number 6 by giving you a little example of something that we do. Starting a couple years ago, we started doing this exercise in our workshops, and we had people literally, like, physically line up in a room. We created a risk lineup on a scale from 1 to 10, and we ask a series of questions and have people go stand by. You know, where are they? 10 being the highest. Like, how willing are you, generally speaking, to take the risk of offering a point of view? And invariably, in a group of 20, this is kind of what it looks like. Everybody's clustered towards the high end, and everybody says, well, that's my job. I have to do that. If I'm not doing that, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do as a professional. And then I say, all right, how about another question? How willing are you to raise a sensitive topic? Adjust yourself if necessary on the line. And invariably what happens is things start shifting to the left in general. Some people move a little bit higher. You know, it varies person by person, but there's still a sense that raising a sensitive topic, especially if you're in a consultative role, that's my job. So I need to be at the higher end. And then I'll ask, how willing are you to share something personal, in particular with a client or a customer? And invariably what happens is people start moving down to the left, the lower end of the spectrum, because it's not so clear that that's my job. For many people, they assume, you know, that's maybe a nice to have, or maybe quite a number of people make the case that that's completely irrelevant and inappropriate. And then I'll ask the question, so of the 3, what matters most? And you're probably not surprised to hear me say, again, the context is trusted advisorship. If your goal is to be a safe haven for tough issues, they all matter. And what matters for you personally is the one that has earned your lowest score. And for most people, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, the lowest score is sharing something personal, which is why we're highlighting that as tip number 6 of 7 on risk-taking best practices. Now, I'm not saying, again, this isn't carte blanche to share your deepest, darkest secrets. It is an invitation to be human, maybe even in the simplest of ways. When on a Monday morning, you're doing, you know, what could be superficial chit chat with a client and they say, how was your weekend? Maybe you give an answer that goes a little bit beyond fine or great. Give them a little insight into what you did, and who knows what that opens up. Or maybe it doesn't open up anything in the moment or ever, but it does establish you as somebody who's human, not just a professional. So, there are, and by the way, for those who might be thinking that there is no relationship between the sharing personal stuff and real work, I would suggest to you that there actually is impact on real work when you connect in a more human way, not just real work, but your ability to be influential by making yourself human. They're more likely in general to open up to you. And you could also say, that they're far more likely to be receptive to those sensitive topics and sometimes provocative points of view that you have to share. So I would suggest that there is a clear correlation. All right, I'm almost at my time, which is good because I'm about to tell you what tip number 7 is, and I've got another story to share to bring us home. This tip, by the way, is not in the Trusted Advisor Fieldbook. It's a late ad as of a couple of years ago, I guess. And I'm going to illustrate it with a story that I heard one of my clients, a partner in a global firm, share about. He was talking about being in a one-on-one meeting with a client one day, and early on in the meeting, it became pretty clear to him that she was stressed. So he made the mental note, she seems stressed. He set it aside, had an agenda, limited time, proceeded with the meeting, but at the end of all the tasks being accomplished, the client actually opened a door and said, so, is there anything else we need to talk about? And that's when he leaned in and he took a risk. He said, seems to me like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. And she said, as a matter of fact, she opened up about dealing with some pretty significant career challenges. And that's when he in turn said, what you're sharing with me reminds me of a comedy special I just saw by comedian Ali Wong. And Ali Wong did a Netflix special when she was pregnant at one point, and she was sort of making fun of Sheryl Sandberg's, phrase about leaning in. And Ali Wong said, look, let's face it, sometimes I don't want to lean in, I just want to lie down. And the partner recounted that story to his client. He says, it sounds like you just want to lie down rather than lean in. And she laughed, and they proceeded to have a pretty significant and meaningful heart-to-heart about her situation. So inside of the story is a different kind of risk that the partner chose to take, which is the risk of bringing humor, which is tip number 7. There's so many ways to incorporate humor. I'm not asking you all to turn yourselves into stand-up comedians with Netflix specials. I'm not asking you to go so far outside your comfort zone that you're creating awkwardness. You've got to suit your personal style in the right way. And of course, it's all situational. You have to ascertain what's appropriate. But I would suggest to you that more often than not, especially in a tense situation, just even a little bit of levity can bring something of value and open something up. By the way, the partner missed an opportunity earlier on in the conversation that relates to what we've already covered on our list. So whoever is the first to point out what the partner did not do in the conversation in chat, we'll review the chat after the webinar, and we'll follow up with you, and I'll send you a free copy of whatever book of your choosing, Trusted Advisor, Trust-Based Selling, or the Trusted Advisor Fieldbook. But back to humor for a second. What the partner did was use humor to show empathy, and there's so many ways to do that. There's a lot of great stuff on YouTube. If YouTube is ever appropriate for you to draw from, one of my favorites is a little video clip about the 11 stages of your workday, and they're just little snippets of, babies in different expressions and different tasks. I know very few people who don't laugh or at least, chuckle a little bit or smile at this. But if that's not appropriate for you, okay, leave the videos behind, but look at ways that you can use humor to address awkwardness. Like, wouldn't it have been nice if Jared had had a little levity at his fingertips in that sales meeting? Whew, that really loud silence has my collar feeling a little bit tight. Or if Adam had called the client back, the one he accidentally said, I love you to, and said, oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you I won't be home for dinner. It's a completely different situation. It's a game changer at that point. You can use humor to express your emotions. I was frustrated recently with a client who had just a door, and this person just wasn't getting back to me in the way that I needed. And every caveat I came up with to try to address it just felt snarky. So I went the GIF mode. I sent a text message with a guy hyperventilating, saying, all right, I'm really stressed out now. We've got to sort this out. I got an immediate response, completely dispelled the tension. So there are a lot of different ways that you can bring humor in. By the way, I don't know if anybody entered, but what the partner missed was an opportunity early on in that conversation to tackle the ambiguity, because and the cue was he's thinking to himself, she seems, ambiguity alert. So there's an opportunity to say early on, hey, at the risk of derailing our agenda here, and we can certainly get right back to it, I can't help but notice. And they might have had an even completely different conversation then had he had the courage to do that and the presence of mind. So by way of wrapping up before we officially open for Q&A, here's the real question. Self-awareness is essential if what you're aiming for is trusted advisorship, because that's the only way you get to self-mastery. And the question for you is, scale of 1 to 10 of the 7 items, which is the most, which tip poses the greatest opportunity for you? It is, by the way, whatever your answer is and however confronted you might feel by that answer, there is hope. The good news is that what it really takes, it turns out, to conquer even our most primal of fears, it's simple. It's practice. It's doing it again and again and again. And if you haven't seen the TED Talk delivered by Commander Chris Hadfield, an astronaut who was at one point the commander of the International Space Station, if you haven't heard him tell a story about what it was like for him to go blind in space, temporarily, fortunately, but and how he conquered that, I highly recommend it. We've also got resources to help in the Fieldbook. If you happen to have a copy of it, page 77 has a worksheet that helps you really dissect and look at the relationships that are working well, where risk is present, and other relationships, and what are the risks you could take. If you don't have a copy of the Fieldbook, no worries. We've got one of your takeaways, some brief stuff for today. I'm going to give you a compilation of all the worksheets and chapter synopses from the book, a couple of articles, the 6 risks you should take, which are in the book, the new 7th risk-taking strategy, the humor one I wrote an article about. If you want to practice that 1 to 10 thing with your team and facilitate a dialogue around risk-taking in your organization, I wrote about how to run that activity. So that's that. If you haven't checked out Charlie's podcast lately, by the way, brief commercial message for Charlie's podcast and some of the other work that we do, he tackles a lot of risky topics, like asking a client for a rate increase is a recent favorite of mine. And if you don't know our work, trustedadvisor.com or the getrealproject.com gives you information about workshops, webinars, diagnostics, the work that we do. Okay, brief commercial over.
We do have some questions teed up for you. I'm just going to roll right into them. So there's somebody that's on the call that works in the healthcare industry that's been private messaging me a lot of different questions about basically, like, how do you one question that they asked was, how would you handle sharing bad information with a client while building trust? And then there's other questions about eliciting information from patients in a way that they would take it seriously. So I think it's some of it. This person, he or she works in the area of administration and the overall operations, but I think they're trying to figure out a company-wide protocol for the stuff.
So the first one, like when you have bad information, does that mean like you've got bad news to deliver? Like, how can you do that and build trust at the same time? Am I getting that? The gist of that?
I think that's part of it, the question, and then I think also there might be like something like a data breach or something. I think there's larger issues. I think it's probably on the individual patient doctor level, and then maybe on a organization to patient level from a higher level.
Okay, so big, deep, heavy questions. I'll give you the best that I can with what I know in here. The first is to remember we got to get our mindset right and not assume that because serious things happen, like data breaches or difficult diagnoses or difficult messages, that doesn't immediately mean that trust is off the table. In fact, there are opportunities, and it all boils down to how we handle them. And I'm a big fan of the caveats and the being prompt and concise and just leaning in and dealing with stuff and doing that in a sensitive way to say, look, I'm here with news I never wanted to have to deliver to you, and I'm just going to give it to you straight. Here it is. And then there's the who you're being in the what follows and the conversation that follows, especially in the patient relationship. I've done a little bit of work with people in the medical profession, not as much as work in consulting, but you cannot overstate the value of empathy and the importance of listening and reacting in an empathetic way. It doesn't mean you have to agree. It doesn't mean the tough stuff goes away. It just means you show you've got some sensitivity in the face of some really difficult stuff. And that's what may sound overly simplistic, but I would suggest there's some simple answers to how you not only maintain trust, but potentially increase it significantly in the face of some of those things.
Great. So the next question is, how do you nurture informed risk taking when your team leader is risk adverse and controlling in parentheses?
Oh, yay, the controlling team leader. This is what everybody loves. So, my short answer to that is small steps. Like, eat the elephant a bite at a time. I think you want to be careful not to overwhelm them with so much risk that, it puts them in like over control, hyper fear mode. And controlling behavior, by the way, which I know well and personally because I'm a mostly recovering control freak. Controlling behavior is just a sign of fear. So you don't want to put them into, complete spasm, freak out, survival mode because you're taking such big risks in the face of that. But take a series of small ones and build up and be the role model. And that's unfortunate too, by the way, when it's your team leader, it's your leader. And the unfortunate answer is you see the opportunity, you know more about trust building and risk taking than you do. It's on you to make the first move. So small steps, progress over time.
Here's the next one. Any advice on how to break down the internal emotional barriers of being real in the moment? Now, obviously, we all freeze up and, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I don't know, 20 years of therapy and a lot of self-help. It can certainly help. So anything you can do to be self-aware and do your own work. I'm also a big fan, like in those deer in headlights moments. And I think there's some neuroscience that links to a phenomenon known as labeling. If you can basically like call it out or make an observation about it, I find that helps, at least me. It helps unfreeze. For example, imagine I'm on a stage giving a talk to a couple thousand people and I have no notes and I completely forget what I was going to say next. It's happened. What I found is the best thing to do for a whole variety of reasons is to cop to it. Oh my gosh, I've completely lost my train of thought. I have no idea what I was going to say next. And a number of things happen in that moment. One is I unfreeze.
Right.
Something about saying that, it releases something, the amygdala hijack in the brain that's going crazy, quiets down a little bit, and then it creates great rapport with people.
Well, I think just to add to that, I've had my own stuff with anxiety. If you say don't be afraid, it tends to make it worse. But if you acknowledge your fear, just say I'm scared, it tends to go away. I think same kind of thing.
To your point, Jason, we're never going to banish fear in our relationships. No matter at what levels of trusted advisorship we achieve in our careers, fear does not go away. It's not about abolishing fear. It's about courage in the face of fear. And You're right, acknowledging it, just calling it out. And this is where humor helps too. Bring a little levity to the moment. Everybody can relate. We're not the only ones walking around scared to death. Everybody's walking around scared to death.
So the next question is let's see, how do you get personal? This is an interesting one that I've seen Charlie answer in different ways. How should you get personal when a client has their barriers up and is very stiff and is business only? Yeah.
Well, I'm guessing I'm going to answer similarly to Charlie, which is, small steps. And you just never know the difference that you're making. Small steps, try different things. If one tactic doesn't work, try another. Check your motives. Make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, not because you're trying to conquer somebody's barriers, but because you really do want what's best for the relationship and best for them. Because we can get really driven, like, all right, I'm going to beat this guy down. I'm going to win here. But the tendency we all have is to give up and say, they're not receptive, they're not open, I'm going to go practice with somebody else. And I think that's the wrong thing to do. Because more than anything, another way to think about this is trusted advisorship is a way of being. It is a way of being that you bring to all your interactions. And so show up fundamentally the same way with everybody, but get creative, try different things.
Would you recommend just keeping it business only and not, and just staying within the confines of the business, or do you think?
In a certain moment, you might make that choice, but I'm always going to be looking for opportunities. Maybe it's not at the beginning of the next meeting. Maybe it's at the end. Maybe I show up a little early next time, whether it's on the call or in person. Maybe at the end of a meeting when the tasks have been handled, it's a little bit safer for somebody to engage in a personal way. You know, I think you should always be striving, always trying. And oh, by the way, keep in mind that having personal conversations, like chatting about your kids, that's one way to build intimacy. But being a phenomenal empathetic listener is a way to build intimacy and trust in any interaction. And you can bring that to the people who have the, you know, the fortresses there. So that's another tactic to take.
Yep. So the last question, and everybody, we still have a lot of people on the call, so feel free to ask some more questions because we'll stick around. But
I don't have to hang up right now. I'll just hang out.
What's the best, this sounds like a very specific example, so I kind of lost the person who asked this, but if you're still on and you want to get more detailed, what's the best way to deal with a colleague that makes a decision that puts you at risk and potentially compromises your trust with others?
Yeah. Thoughtfully and directly are my short answers. I mean, I think, like, here's the unfortunate message. When you feel like somebody has lost your trust, you can no longer trust them. Unless you're willing to address it, there's a case to be made that you're just as untrustworthy. And so I think it's important to raise it and deal with it. That's where caveats really are your friend. Bringing some compassion, maybe doing a little pre-work that says, why might they be doing what they're doing, or why might they have done what they did? How could I make sense of this? How could I understand it? But just dealing with the stuff, it goes back to, I think it was tip number 4. Well, it's not really deliver bad news per se, but it's acknowledge the discomfort and have the hard conversations.
So somebody's actually asking about the trust equation, and I'll let you guide them to more resources because we have a lot of resources, but somebody's specifically asking what self-orientation means in the trust equation.
Great question. And let me make a note. I'm going to add to our takeaway packet of free stuff. We'll add some free stuff on the trust equation. Basically, self-orientation equates to where your focus is. Is your focus on them or is your focus on you? It's in the denominator of the trust equation because we want self-orientation to be as low as possible. And you work on self-orientation by working 2 things. You always check in your motives. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Is it in my own self-interest? Is it to protect myself? Is it because I'm fearful? Or am I really doing something in service of the relationship? And then where's your attention? That's the other way we manage and monitor self-orientation. Is my attention really on them? Am I tuning in? Am I curious? Am I in their world? Am I caring about them, lined up with what their goals are, joining them in that way?
Great. And I think, we can send out a link to the trust equation, the email. If you go to trustadvisor.com under understanding the basics on the site, there's lots of information about the trust equation that gets into each piece of it. I think that's it. That's the last of the questions. So I'm just going to do a quick closeout. Thanks everybody for attending. We're going to send a full copy of the webinar to everybody over email if you want to watch this. We have more webinars coming up at trustadvisor.com/webinars. Andrea, I'll pass it off to you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's been my pleasure. And, oh, sorry, Jason, I wasn't expecting you to pass it back to me. I don't have some pithy, brilliant thing to say to end, but maybe I'll just say not only do we need walk-on music from me, but we need walk-off music too. That would really complete the webinar experience.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. This is a great turnout, and we appreciate the engagement. We'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, Jason.
Bye.